Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. This is, if I've got my count right, part 19 of my bookshelf tour. Been going on for years now. I don't do it very regularly, usually just when I need some content to fill in here and there. But I'm actually not going to use a timer. I've traditionally used a 10-minute timer and see how far through my bookshelf I can talk in 10 minutes. But I want to, as we maybe finish up, I'm not sure if we probably have less than a handful of these left, maybe as little as just 2 more after this one. But I want to group them, since my books and other things are often grouped by some kind of theme. I'm just going to kind of talk through each grouping of things so it can be more easily categorized when I put it up as a YouTube video and stuff like that. So this time, however long it takes me, I'm going to talk through briefly, just give an overview of my apologetics books that I've kind of acquired over the years. I started out kind of engaging in apologetics resources primarily because of my own doubts and insecurities. I'm just wired to always have the what if monster on my shoulder saying, what if you missed a detail? What if you're fooling yourself? All that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of emotion that comes with those kinds of thoughts. And so what I found I need to do is not give weight to my emotions, but look at the facts and look at the evidence and look at what they seem to be indicating is the truth, and then allow that to override any feelings that I might be having. So in recent years, although I've continued to be interested in apologetics, it's not been as passionate of a hobby of mine, and I also have found that a lot of the questions that I had over time I've just kind of come to satisfying answers, found satisfying information, and so I'm not in it as regularly, and then also I'm not acquiring books near as regularly, about apologetics, because there are great online resources like reasonablefaith.org is kind of like the default go-to website that I refer people to. That's William Lane Craig's website. So anyway, but let me just walk you through kind of some of the books that I have. Let's see, we've got Journey into the Light. Now, this one, looks like I got about halfway through before just indefinitely pausing on. I got this during a time that a friend of mine was expressing his interest in near-death experiences and stuff like that, and so I wanted to find something that was going to be a little bit more clinical, a little bit more objective, and in some cases, from a Christian perspective, what's the Christian take on this? And so this one, it definitely presents the Christian take. It's not always as clinical as I would like it to be, but I think that it makes a lot of really good points, and it does represent the information pretty well, but not as well. I didn't find it as compelling as this one, Beyond Death. And this one cost a pretty penny, even though it's a paperback, but it's Gary Habermas and J.P. Moreland, 2 pretty well-known thinkers in Christian academia. And Gary Habermas, a lot of his focus in his studies is on resurrection, and he makes just some fantastic arguments for resurrection based on evidence that even liberal non-Christian scholars accept to be the truth. So he's got a very interesting kind of approach to defending the veracity of the resurrection, and that's relevant here because this one, more than any books by Christians or non-Christians that I've kind of read or skimmed through, this one really handles the information, the data responsibly, and is dealing with evidential cases. And by that I mean it's not just recording instances where someone had a near-death experience and then they report, I had such and such experience, I had such and such. Well, who knows? All kinds of people have all kinds of experiences. But this, they're gathering data, maybe exclusively, I can't remember, it's been a while since I read this, but primarily from people that, while having a near-death experience, were able to perceive things that there is no way they could have perceived if they were if their brain activity, was the only thing that's capable of allowing them to think. So while they were brain dead, while their heart was stopped, they were seeing things, traveling to other places, and finding information that they never could have known and stuff. And so, and then, and giving more weight to those kinds of experiences. And anyway, it is also from a Christian perspective, and they're very clear about that from the beginning. And so it's a book that is designed to be read by both Christians and non-Christians, but they, in a very, I think, gracious way and a very responsible way, invite people that are not Christians to hear them out and consider the data that they present and what that data indicates. And there's a number of different chapters in here. A lot of them are on near-death experiences, but there are also chapters covering the nature of body and soul, dualism and eternal life is one chapter. The resurrection of Jesus gets a very significant chapter, actually a couple chapters dedicated to that, including objections to Jesus' resurrection, because if Jesus not only resuscitated, but actually rose from the dead in a vibrant, restored, and upgraded body, then he certainly is the best authority on what happens to us after this life. And so we ought to pay attention to him if those claims about him are true. So that's very relevant to these questions about what happens after we die. And so anyway, I have read most of this book. I've jumped around a little bit and also done a good amount of cover-to-cover reading and stuff. So I've probably read about 75% of it, but that's Beyond Death by Habermas and Moreland, and on the topic of near-death experiences and on the resurrection. I've found it to be one of the best resources out there on those things. Okay, so this is kind of like going way into my past. Here's a book published in 1998 titled True for You, But Not for Me by Paul Copan. And this is a very popular level book. It's not really sophisticated, heady philosophy and stuff like that, or apologetics. It's meant to be very readable by the everyman. And in the late 90s, I mean, I remember that. I graduated high school in 96 and then, started into college right after that. And I remember a lot during that time, relativism kind of taking hold, and this idea that something could be, well, that's true for you, but that's not true for me. And even today we hear these relative uses of the word truth, like speak your truth, and I'm like, well, how can one truly possess truth? I mean, I think only God, if he exists, and of course I believe he does, if God exists, then he would be the only being that's truly capable of possessing truth. Otherwise, truth is just that which corresponds to reality. It's it's that which is objectively real. And so there's these different slogans. All religions lead to God. Who are you to judge others? Jesus was just another great religious leader. Christians are so intolerant. And a lot of these kind of like phrases, well, as they say, slogans, that would typically leave, as they say, leave Christians speechless. And I kind of, oh my gosh, how do I respond to that? And so on a very popular level, I think this is a good book, or at least it was when I read it 20 years ago or something like that. I think I've revisited a time or two since then, but it wasn't long after this, maybe just a handful of years, that I really started being interested in apologetics material with a much more academic leaning, a much more sophisticated presentation, and more complexity and depth to them. But I still found True for You, But Not for Me by Paul Copan to be a useful book for me in its time. Here's one I don't think I've read this at all. Mormon Chronicles. This is probably, let's see, what does this say? No, I'm not going to read this whole description here. It's basically a person who was a Mormon and then became a believer, and then this is kind of him telling his story, So this would be I put it with my apologetic stuff because it has to do with, responding to people who are having or have had the experience of being in the Mormon Church and believing the doctrines associated with that. But I can't vouch for this book at all. I mean, it's one of those books that, like, I got it. Maybe I read some of it and probably had the best of intentions to read the rest of it. It's a really short book, pretty big print. I don't know why I still have it. Actually, I do. It's because I'm too lazy to get around and clean my office. But Mormon Chronicles by Tom Hall. No idea if it's any good. Let's see here. Mormon Claims. So this one, I actually had during high school. Oh my gosh, copyright 1989. So this one had been out for a while, even though I would have bought it probably in 93 to 96, somewhere in there. And this one, I've got a lot of marks in here, a lot of underlined stuff. I live in Mesa, Arizona, and so outside of Utah, we might have the largest, population of those that subscribe to the LDS faith. And so, I was interacting with Mormons all the time, and really wanted to learn where they're coming from, what their beliefs are about, and what separates their beliefs from biblical Christian belief. And so this was very eye-opening, and actually lent this to a Mormon friend I remember in high school, and she didn't say that like any of the descriptions here, at least that I recall. It's been a long time, but I don't remember her saying that like there was anything that misrepresented beliefs of the Mormon Church. I mean, she wouldn't have necessarily agreed with everything he said in terms of the arguments that he was making, but in terms of how he represented the teaching of the Mormon Church, I believe she said that it was a pretty accurate representation. But anyway, there's some pretty salty things that I wrote in margins that I wouldn't say today. But but that, born out of my insecurity in high school, I'm sure. Okay, this one's another one by Paul Copan, and it had been years since I'd read True for You But Not for Me when I bought this one. I think he was a guest speaker at our church a number of years ago, and afterward I bought this book from his like little merch table or whatever. But Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God by Paul Copan, and this is really a response to the what is it? There's a thing. There's like the four atheists of the apocalypse. I don't know. There was some new atheists. They I think they kind of called themselves that I think is Sam something. And I can't remember any of their names off the top of my head. I'm terrible. But gosh, no, I need to think here. I need to think. Okay, yeah, it's Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. I'm not really familiar with Daniel Dennett, but I've seen and or read material from Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris, and really found it to be, having some passion and some bite in the tone, but really substanceless in terms of argument. But a lot of people, I think, not knowing kind of in the moment how to react and how to think through the arguments they're making, have felt like, oh my gosh, well, because one of the key arguments from new atheists is against, quote unquote, the God of the Old Testament, and how there's really just some hard things that God did, and some seemingly harsh things, some seemingly at a glance maybe cruel things, where we look at the character of God and we're like, wow, is he a loving God? What's going on here? And actually right now with my church, I'm reading through the Bible in a year. It's something that I haven't done since high school. And I'm reading through some stuff in the early books of the Old Testament that is hard to read, but there's so much that we're missing in terms of what's going on in the cultural context, the historical context, what is meant in the original languages versus how they were translated, how sometimes the full meaning doesn't come across. And so this is largely a book that helps you understand the cultural context of the various things that were going on in the Old Testament, the various things that God did with, for, and to the nation of Israel. It doesn't mean that there aren't some things in the Old Testament that aren't still hard to read, but it does, I think, effectively dispel the notion that God is unfair and cruel and unloving and some kind of a sadistic killjoy or something like that. Those things really, I think he can only be accused of at an uninformed, uneducated glance. So this is a really there are actually, I think, a few arguments that are better than those that he presents here. But I think that this is really pretty solid material. I've read, again, about 75% of it. The stuff in the final chapters wasn't as relevant to me. It wasn't stuff that I needed to sort through in my mind. But anyway, yeah, this is a good apologetics books for anybody who has wondered what in the world is going on with the Old Testament. How could, for example, God say to Abraham, go up to this mountain and kill your son on it, and how could a loving God do that? And a number of other things that we see in the Old Testament. If you ever had any kind of questions about that or concerns about that as a believer, then Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? I think is definitely worth checking out. Let's see here. Okay, 2 books I'll breeze by pretty quickly because I haven't read them, but they're both by, both by Hugh Ross? Yeah, one of them's co-written by Hugh Ross. This one's Hugh Ross by himself, and that's Why the Universe is the Way It Is. And the other one, Origins of Life by Hugh Ross and Fazale Rana. And I've not read either of these because very soon after buying these, I think I started listening to William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith podcast and his Defenders podcast, and I just, while I was jogging and stuff, and so I was just kind of getting my fill of information on topics like those discussed in these books. I was getting that there, and so I just didn't feel the pull to read these books, and have still never gotten around to them. Hugh Ross is, there is some controversy with Hugh Ross in terms of what his views are. I mean, certainly Young Earth creationists are going to have major issues with Hugh Ross. He is usually at the center of their dartboard in things that they're publishing, I've noticed. But I mean, even among other Christians that also hold to some form of an old earth view of creation, like William Lane Craig, has some significant disagreements with Ross as well. So anyway, haven't read these books, can't recommend either of them or recommend not reading them, but that's Hugh Ross, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, and Ross and Rana, Origins of Life. All right, let's see here. Okay, so now we're getting into a little bit more popular level stuff. The Case for a Creator. This is by Lee Strobel, who's most well known, I think, for his The Case for Christ, which was also made into a movie about his coming to faith. But this is, I think he did Case for, I can't remember if he did Faith or Christ first, but I've also got those here. Case for Faith by Lee Strobel, and The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And if you're not familiar with his story, he was a journalist in, I believe, the 70s that worked for a well-known newspaper and was very antagonistic toward Christianity. But at one point, and you can watch the movie to get an idea of like what was going on and what motivated his search. But he just decided, okay, I'm going to disprove Christianity. He had a wife that was buying into it, in terms of his perspective. That anyway, and he was kind of getting tired of it and the seeming hold that it had on her, and so he set out to disprove it. But in the process of investigating, he again and again was seeing, oh my gosh, the evidence actually points to, if I really just look at the evidence for what it is, it really actually points to Jesus truly rising from the dead and his claims being true. And as a result, he became a Christian. And so anyway, of these, I mean, I think The Case for Christ is probably the one that I find most interesting. It has to do with evidences for the resurrection. Now, of course, I've found much more compelling material about the resurrection than this. Lee Strobel's books are written for a popular level. They're recounting his journey, and they have a little bit of spice and flavor to them as he's kind of grilling some of these experts and really trying to poke holes in their arguments and stuff. And so it's written in many ways to be an interesting read, a compelling read, in addition to providing some information. But it's really, compared to a number of other resources that I would recommend instead, it's solid, but not near as in-depth as I would like. But it's a great starting place, and for many people, these books will present enough information for them to feel settled in the arguments for the truth of Christianity. So anyway, that's The Case for a Creator, The Case for Faith, and The Case for Christ, all by Lee Strobel. Just a few more to get through here. All right, this one. So this is "Can Man Live Without God," which the dust jacket is lost for. But this is by Ravi Zacharias, and since his passing, of course, it's come out that he committed years and years of sexual impropriety, which put, of course, a big and tragic stain on his ministry and horribly affected who knows how many women. So you might be asking yourself, well, Peter, why do you still have this book in your library? Well, I don't have it here to recommend it to you, even though when I look at the actual arguments, the truth here is not changed by the way Ravi tragically chose to live his life and abuse other people. The truth here, the arguments here, still hold very true. There are some anecdotes. Zacharias very commonly used anecdotes about personal experiences he had that, if he was living a good amount of the time in the mode of lying, then, can we trust those anecdotes? I think that there's reason to call those into question. But ultimately, it's the anecdotes are intended to connect with people, which he himself would say, on an emotional level and kind of help them engage with the facts. And so you could skip all of the anecdotes and just assume he's lying about all of them, and then look at the actual arguments themselves. The arguments still hold up. But obviously, that it's going to take a lot of parsing. It's going to take a lot of, okay, well, I keep this, I throw this out, da-da-da-da. That's why I don't recommend, Ravi Zacharias, his material to anybody anymore, because there's just too much that too many caveats I would have to give, too much, there's just easier resources to recommend. And that's really sad, because that basically, for so many people, flushes down the toilet the usefulness of all the books and resources that Zacharias left behind. Not because the arguments contained in them aren't good, they're still good, but it's that there's just too much of a mess, especially if you're wanting to talk to somebody who's feeling antagonistic toward Christianity and the arguments for it, or if as a believer you're doubting and wondering, have I been lied to? Have are the people that are telling me things, reliable representations of the truth and stuff? Well, then you're going to have major reasons to doubt Ravi Zacharias' material. But I read this one, "Can Man Live Without God," during college. Or actually, it was pretty late in college. Early in college, it was too sophisticated. The writing was too above my current reading level to really hold my interest. I was having to look up a lot of words and stuff. But toward the end of college, and then certainly after college as well, I found this book to be very useful in terms of the arguments that it presents for theism and specifically for Christianity. So anyway, with all the caveats and the mess involved with that, that is "Can Man Live Without God" by Ravi Zacharias. Let's see here. Oh, another one. That is hard to really recommend, even though I think it's got some really good content, is Norman Geisler and Ronald Brooks' book, "Come Let Us Reason: An Introduction to Logical Thinking." Now, I think for Christians, this could be a very good resource, just an introduction to thinking logically. And there's really not much Christian quote unquote about this book. It's really just a course in logic and various types of logical fallacies to kind of be watching out for, and so it's a book that can equip you to evaluate an argument and see whether or not it's actually a good argument, or if there's some kind of logical problem with the argument that disqualifies it for consideration. And so the reason that I can't really recommend this one is because Norman Geisler, who has passed away now, in some of his content I noticed seemed to lack consideration for the fact that non-believers might be reading his work or watching his material, and he could be a little bit insensitive, I think, if I can say that and still be respectful of his work. I really value his systematic theology. It's a, what is it, a 1, 2, 3, 4, it's a 4-volume set. That was the first thing that I and my study mentor went through years ago, back in, we started that in like 2007 and finished it in I don't know, 1 or 2 years. Made our way slowly, methodically through those, and there was a lot of great content in there. I didn't agree with everything, neither did my mentor, but a lot of really useful content. I still have them. I still, every once in a while, refer back to them. He's both a philosopher and an apologist. And so he's made some really great content. But, for example, in Come Let Us Reason, I read this with a non-believing friend of mine who had been a believer at one point but has stepped away from his faith. And, I thought, man, if he could better apply some principles of logic to his thinking, I think he would just discover for himself the problems with some of the beliefs that he's come to adopt. But very soon after getting into this book with him, I just saw the slant, not in terms of the arguments. I mean, the arguments hold, but him just kind of saying some things now and then about what a non-believer might believe, and just kind of like almost kind of mocking it as like only a foolish person would believe this, if you. So there's just some real insensitivity for someone that's not a believer. I would have much preferred that a book like this had been written by Christians but was not for a Christian audience. I think sometimes, as Christians, when we feel like we're just among ourselves, we can fall prey to being insensitive when we're talking about people that are not believers or people that hold a different view than we are. And I think that that's on display a lot these days on the internet, when people will sometimes assume that they're in just an isolated environment where everyone is probably going to agree with them, and so then they'll just kind of cut loose a little bit, not realizing that, actually, anybody could see this potentially, and sometimes you can be surprised at who does see something that you thought would never see it. So I think maybe if he was born just like 20 years later and would have seen a little bit more of the internet age, then he would have developed a little bit more sensitivity. I think the arguments are still good. I think the material is still strong in a lot of ways, but there's definitely some caveats to recommending Come Let Us Reason by Norman L. Geisler and Ronald M. Brooks. And then finally, I'll talk about these two kind of in one go here. It's Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. Volumes 1 and 2, which now are basically sold as a single volume. And this was an interesting book to buy. I bought this in the late 90s in college. And it's really not a book. It's more like a reference book where he quotes a whole lot of resources that give information about the history of Jesus and the development, the collection of the canon that we now know as the Bible. These were all separate books written, hundreds and hundreds of years apart in many cases, but now we've got them in this single book. How did the Bible become the Bible, as it were? And so I think this work has been updated a few times over the years, but it's not one that I reference now because I really I tend to go to like website resources that can more quickly stay updated with the most recent research. And, by the time a book like this gets published, then within a few years, you've got people making arguments against it and present. I mean, I remember finding online early in the birth of the internet, people that would, offer, like, have a whole website dedicated. Okay, here's my argument against this point, this point, this point, this point. And it's not that their arguments were necessarily good or not, but I mean, those arguments then should be responded to. And so when we were locked into print publishing, there was less chance for kind of a public discourse between the writer or the content creator and the audience reading it. And now that's much more possible with things like blogs and regularly updated content. And so, again, that just kind of brings it full circle to what I said at the beginning, that like now these days I find responsible, solid, academically sourced resources online to explore issues of apologetics and defending the Christian faith. And so a lot of these books, and in particular, these Josh McDowell books, which were great for me at the time, but I just don't have much use for them. And I kind of, like a number of books in my library, don't know why I still have them. Well, I do, again, because I'm too lazy to clean my office. But I guess that is all I have for now. Next time, I think we're going to get into actually some of my hymnals. Maybe I'll share some of my favorite hymns, even though in my most formative years I was not at a church that was singing hymns. Just some other stuff maybe related to the time that I spent as a worship pastor. So we'll get to all of that next time. But that's all for now. Thanks. Bye-bye. Summer insanity.
Liberate.